While cleaning out the attic, David came across a recently taken photograph, and in it, Maria appeared as clear as day, even though she had been dead for 27 years. Was the wife he had long believed gone truly still alive, or had it all been nothing more than a carefully staged play to conceal a terrible secret? David Marshall, a veteran in his early 50s, lived quietly in an old wooden house on the outskirts of Pennsylvania. Late in the afternoon, he climbed up to the attic, where the smell of rotting wood, damp paper, and rusted metal clung to the air like ghosts of the past. In a dark corner, he pulled out a dust-covered wooden box, inside of which were wrinkled letters, a battlefield map, and a tarnished silver medal. Familiar keepsakes slid through his hands until he suddenly froze. Among the stack of old papers, a small photograph emerged. His heart skipped, and then pounded like a war drum. The face of Maria, the wife he had believed dead for nearly 3 decades, was clear in the picture. Those eyes, that bridge of the nose, that fleeting smile, they could not be mistaken. Time itself seemed to have passed her by, for the face looked hardly older than the last day he had seen her. David was stunned, his whole body rigid, his breath caught in his throat, as though the narrow attic had suddenly lost all its air. The wind hissed through the roof slats. The sheets of tin rattled above as if echoing the tremor inside his chest. He flipped the photo, searching for a date or a scribbled note, but the back was blank. Only faint scratches, and the yellowing paper suggested it had been kept by someone for many years. David slumped down, the photo slipping from his hand, sliding across the wooden floor until it stopped near a rusted nail. The attic darkened in his vision, leaving only memories flooding back. The night of fire and chaos tore into his mind. Explosions, smoke, the sky glowing red with flames over the battlefield. Maria's scream in the chaos, her hand slipping from his grip in an instant. David had chased after her, but a blast swallowed the space between them, turning everything into the nightmare he carried for 27 years. He remembered the day he was handed her death certificate, the look in his superior's eyes when he said the body had never been found. He had believed, forced himself to believe, that his wife was gone. And yet now, this photograph shattered the wall of memory he had built. Shock and confusion surged through him, but deep inside flickered a fragile hope, one he thought had long gone cold. He picked the photo back up, his hand trembling, his eyes wide like a man pulled back from death. Old pain surged, but alongside it came the haunting question: if Maria was alive, why had she never returned? David sat motionless, listening only to the pendulum clock downstairs marking each lost year. In the attic's shadows, his face lined with age, his eyes now blazed with the fire of truth. His body shook, caught between disbelief and the instinct that this was only the beginning of a path that would drag him once more into the darkness of war. He clutched the photo tight, breath unsteady, the smell of old paper mixing with the smoke of memory. That night, the attic was no longer a place for storing keepsakes, but the starting point of a storm of memory that bore the name Maria. David Marshall sat in silence in the living room as night pressed down. The photograph of Maria resting on the cracked wooden table under the dim, uneven glow of a yellow lamp. He opened an old metal box and drew out a faded brown envelope sealed long ago with a military stamp. Inside lay Maria's death certificate, the paper he had trusted for nearly 3 decades. Yet now, under the weary light, small irregularities surfaced, revealing truths he had once forced himself to ignore. The certificate listed the date of her death in combat, but the numbers were blurred, the ink smudged across the edge, as if someone had stamped it in haste. His eyes locked on the officer's signature, an unfamiliar name, one that had never appeared on the rosters of the unit he knew by heart. David remembered that day clearly. After the explosion, chaos everywhere, yet the report had claimed, body recovered. His chest tightened. He had never seen his wife's remains with his own eyes. He had only listened to a superior's clipped words. Why had he accepted it so easily? He shuffled through more documents. An administrative report, written in dry official language, until the final line froze his blood. Personal effects missing, no individual evidence attached. Maria had always worn a silver wedding ring, the one he had slipped onto her finger before leaving base. If her body had been recovered, why was the ring not mentioned? David leaned back in the chair, eyes shut tight, memories crashing like a storm surge. He recalled the nights after the blast, sitting in a field hospital tent, ears ringing, clutching the notice of death with no strength left to resist. He had been wounded, exhausted, broken. His commander told him, the best thing is to accept it, and he had done so because he no longer had the strength to fight. Now every line on that death certificate cut into his chest like a knife. He sprang up, moved quickly to the bookshelf, and pulled down an old storage box. Inside were yellowed pages, medical records, Casualty lists, documents he had kept as a soldier who never forgot his fallen comrades. Tonight he sifted through them one by one, comparing signatures, stamps, codes. Each page revealed another flaw. An ink seal pressed crooked, handwriting in a different stroke, even one report with the wrong date for the battle itself. Suspicion rose like a tide. David's heart ached, not only at the thought that Maria might still be alive, but at the possibility that his entire life had rested on a lie. For 27 years, every time he lit a candle beneath her framed portrait, he may have been mourning a truth that never existed. His shoulders shook, his hands crumpling the paper until it bent and wrinkled. In that silence, the pendulum clock beat heavy seconds into the room. David opened a drawer and pulled out a lighter engraved with M and M. Maria and Marshall, the last thing he had believed to be her legacy. Now, staring at it, remorse surged. If Maria had not died, then where had she been for 27 years? Why had she never returned? And who had written this false certificate? He set the photograph beside the death certificate. On one side, Maria's face, alive in a crowd, vivid as if seen only yesterday. On the other, a cold, faded sheet of paper, letters stamped without soul. The contrast cut into him like a blade. The room seemed to shrink around him, the air squeezed away. He knew he could no longer remain still. The years of silence were over, and the road ahead, no matter how dark, would begin tonight when the truth had to be unearthed from the ashes. The night had settled deep, and the only light left in the room came from the cold glow of the computer screen washing over David's hollow face. He sat motionless at the desk, the photograph of Maria scanned and magnified on the monitor. Her features appeared so clear that he felt, for a fleeting moment, he could reach out and touch her. His heart pounded hard, his throat tightened, as the cursor hovered over a small detail on the left side of her neck. It was a thin scar, slanting from the hollow of her shoulder upward, about half an inch long, barely hidden beneath a fine silver chain. No one else knew about that scar but him, because he had been the one to take her to a field hospital during an evacuation, when shards of glass from a shattered window tore into her skin. The memory of holding her arm still while the doctor stitched, of her hand gripping his shirt until it ripped, came flooding back in a rush that nearly buckled him. There could be no mistake. That scar was the final proof, the undeniable mark that the woman in the photograph was his Maria. David leaned forward, his eyes wide, his chest heaving. His whole body felt strung tight like a wire stretched to the point of snapping. For 27 years, every doubt, every hope had rested on blurred memories, on gaps and sleepless dreams. But now the scar was alive on the screen, no longer something he could dismiss as an illusion. He zoomed in once more, the image breaking into a haze of pixels, but the scar remained, stubborn and sharp, like a knife carved into his own heart. He pushed the chair back with a jolt and began pacing the room, hands gripping his head. Everything inside the house felt foreign, the framed memorial photo on the shelf, the spent candles, the medals hanging on the wall. The entire life he had built after losing Maria, everything now trembled because of one scar. The pressure crushed each breath. He opened a drawer and pulled out a small bottle of whiskey, but he did not drink. He knew it would only drown him further. Instead, he turned back to the screen, staring into Maria's eyes in the photograph. In them, he saw not only life, but something else: hesitation, fear, the look of someone who knew she was being watched. A chill ran through him. If Maria was alive, why had she not come back? Why had she appeared in a crowd, her face uncovered, yet never sent him a single word? He sat again and opened an old notebook, scribbling in shaky lines. Scar confirmed. No mistake. She is alive. But what happened? Who holds her? Each word struck his mind like a hammer blow. He pressed so hard the pen tore through the paper, leaving grooves on the sheets beneath. In his head, fragments fell into place. The smudged death certificate, the strange officer's signature, the missing personal effects, and now the scar on her neck. Together they formed a dark, jagged picture. David felt heat surge in his temples, his palms wet with sweat. The truth was no longer a vague suspicion, it was a certainty, and that certainty terrified him. The silence was absolute, broken only by the wind seeping through the window and the heavy thud of his own heartbeat. David rose and walked to the wooden shelf, where Maria's old portrait smiled faintly from behind glass. He laid his hand against the cold frame and whispered hoarsely, "You are alive." The words cracked the air, sounding both brittle and solemn, like a vow. No more doubts, no more denial. The truth had surfaced, and it was pulling him toward a path he knew would not lead to peace. Outside, the night pressed hard, the wind rattling the wooden walls. David gripped the enlarged photo in his hand, his eyes burning, his heart igniting with a new fire, a fire that would carry him down into the depths of everything buried. David drove his old pickup through barren mountain passes, the morning light cutting through a thin veil of mist and laying itself across the dirt road that wound toward a border town. This place was nearly 100 miles from his home, a dusty stretch where mercenaries, smugglers, and outlaws often found refuge. He knew it was the same backdrop captured in the photograph, the torn billboard, and the corner of a makeshift market behind Maria's face had given the town away. His heart beat faster as the truck jolted over potholes, dust rising thick across the windshield. Inside his chest, a fragile hope flared. Maybe Maria had truly passed through here. Maybe she lingered close, just a few streets away. The town unfolded before him. Low wooden shacks with rusted tin roofs, pickups sitting lifeless along the roadside like corpses. Hot wind carried the sting of old gasoline and oil smoke, mixed with the heavy stench of liquor spilling from a bar at the corner. David pulled over, stepped out, his boots crunching over dry gravel. His eyes swept the market quickly. Stalls draped with worn cloth, faded tarpaulin tents, faces of locals blended with strangers, all staring back with guarded suspicion. He approached a small photo shop where a few landscape prints hung on the wall. The shopkeeper, a thin man bent over a lens cloth, gave David one glance before shaking his head. "The woman in that picture you're holding. Best not dig. Men have died for less." His voice was rough, lacking kindness, yet carried a warning that felt genuine. David tightened his grip on the photograph, pressing for more, but the man only shrugged, avoiding his eyes, and turned his back to the shadows inside. Hope that had sparked began to dim. David stepped out, moved into the bar next door, searching for another answer. Inside, dim yellow lights pooled over the haze of strong liquor and smoke. Old music crackled low from a speaker. A few men sat scattered about, eyes red, faces marked with scars. David ordered black coffee and chose a corner seat, his soldier's instinct placing him where he could see the whole room and both exits. Before he could take a sip, the door burst open. 3 big men stomped in, their boots thudding on the wooden floor. One caught sight of him, smirked, and the trio walked straight over. The first dropped into the seat across, his fingers tapping a wet table, his voice gravelly. "Old man, the woman in your photo. You'd best forget her. Around here, curious men don't live long." The air stretched taut as a wire. David sat still, his gaze locked on their movements, one hand brushing the lighter in his jacket pocket, a ritual to steel himself for trouble. The second man flicked open a knife, steel glinting under the low light. They wanted to intimidate him, but David was no novice. As the man leaned forward, David drove his boot into the table leg, spilling beer across the surface, then twisted clear of his chair. A sharp blow struck the man's wrist, sending the knife clattering. Chairs screeched, curses filled the room. He slipped through the gap, lunging toward the door. One grabbed his coat, but David spun, driving his shoulder into the man's gut. The air blasted from the thug's chest, buying him enough space to break free. He hit the dirt street running, breath ragged but mind steady. He knew how to get out alive. Soldiers' training taught him to strike fast, clean, never let yourself be boxed in. But when he glanced back, the 3 figures already blocked the bar's doorway, grins carved across their faces. David realized he had revealed too much. The photo shop, the bar, the whole town, it all seemed woven into the same net. The clue he had chased, the fragile hope, had vanished in dust and threats, swallowed by a trap laid long before he arrived. Back in his truck, hands gripping the wheel, sweat traced his brow. His heart still hammered, his eyes still burned with fire. The first lead was gone, but the danger had carved its lesson deep. The truth about Maria was hidden so carefully that someone was ready to kill to keep it buried. Night fell over the border town like a tattered black blanket, heavy with smoke and road dust. Dim neon lights flickered above the narrow alley leading into the night market. David slipped into the crowd, his grey coat pulled high to shadow his worn face. The air was thick with liquor, cigarettes, and scorched meat, a suffocating mix. Shouts from vendors collided with crude laughter, the thin cry of a child's toy horn weaving through as lost kids darted between stalls. In that chaos he moved slow, eyes restless, searching for any thread that might tie him back to Maria. A small stall crouched in a corner, its top stained with grease, hung with old leather bags and stacks of forged papers. The seller, a gaunt man with dull eyes, tapped his cigarette on the table's edge. David stepped closer, his gaze skimming across passports of every color. Each page he turned showed names that meant nothing, faces that did not belong. And then his chest tightened, as though struck a passport that stopped him cold. On the page, Maria Hale. The photograph beside the name was the face he knew too well, too painfully. Maria, her dark hair spilling down, her faint smile, her eyes staring straight into the lens. The same features, the same woman, but with a different name, as if someone had built a false life around her. David's hands clenched until the paper crackled. For a moment, the noise of the market drained away, leaving only the pounding of his heart. "You want to buy it?" the vendor asked, voice low, half challenge, half indifference. David's eyes fixed on the passport, his voice rough. "This woman, do you know where she is?" The man smirked, exhaled smoke into his face, and shook his head. "Paper, that's all. Pay and you get what you see. The real lives behind them don't ask." The flat reply cut like a blade, but it also confirmed what David already felt. Maria had not vanished. She had been given another name. He turned the passport over in his hands. The stamps, the numbers, the country codes, everything crafted with care, not like the cheap counterfeits stacked beside it. Whoever had made this had invested money and power into building this false identity. Who had done it, and for what? He stared deep into Maria's printed eyes, and they seemed to look back, questioning why he had taken so long to find her. Curiosity surged, but beneath it a new hope flared, the kind he thought had been crushed by the ambush at the bar earlier that day. He pulled out his wallet, slapped down cash, his voice sharp. "I'll take it." The vendor shrugged, scooped up the money, and tossed the passport toward him like it was nothing. David slid it inside his coat, stepping back, his gaze still locked on Maria's face on the page. The market roared on, but inside him a fire burned. This false passport was the thread, proof that she had never truly slipped from the world. Outside the market he drew a long breath, the dry night air scraping his lungs, dust and alcohol riding the wind. Against his chest he felt the weight of the passport, as if it carried Maria's heartbeat within it. The name might be false, the life constructed, but the face was real. The scar he had seen, now these papers together, they formed proof she was alive. And if she was alive, there would be a way to find her. David walked on, his shadow stretching long over the gravel road. Curiosity tore at his chest, but for the first time in years, hope flickered steady. Not a dream, not a memory, but a tangible truth he could hold in his hand. Where had she gone? What life had she lived? Who had built this mask for her? He did not yet have the answers, but now he knew he had to keep moving, no matter where this road would lead. The evening after leaving the night market, David stopped at a small roadside diner along the dusty road out of town. The place held only a few worn wooden tables, fluorescent tubes flickering overhead, the air heavy with the mingled smell of fried oil and stale smoke. He sat in a corner, ordered a cup of black coffee, and tucked the false passport deep into his inner pocket, pressing it close to his chest as though it were a sacred relic. His mind spun with questions he could not yet answer, but his heart beat with the faint pulse of hope that had just sparked. The door creaked open. 3 men stepped in, polished shoes striking the floor, their fitted suits shaping lean, disciplined bodies. They carried an aura different from the smugglers and drifters of this town, clean, sharp, deliberate, more like men from a boardroom than a border outpost. David looked away at first, until his gaze locked on a face he knew. His heart stopped. Victor Harlan, once his comrade in the Middle East, a man who had shared the same foxholes, the same long nights with a rifle at the ready. Yet now, standing in front of him, Victor was no soldier. He wore a dark suit with a red tie, his slicked hair combed back, a gold ring flashing under the cold light. He entered the diner as though he owned it. David felt his blood freeze. For 27 years, he had believed Victor dead or vanished somewhere in the wake of war. But here he was alive, strong, unashamed, his eyes sweeping the room until they fixed on David. Victor's mouth curved into a crooked grin, not of friendship, but of mockery. He walked closer, his steps deliberate, his shoes striking the wooden floor like a drumbeat of challenge. "David Marshall." Victor's voice was low, each syllable drawn out. "I never thought you'd still be crawling around. I figured you died with the past." He dropped into the seat across, waving for a bottle of whiskey with a casual flick of his hand. David clenched his fists under the table, his eyes burning holes into the man across from him. Memories crashed back, firelit nights, gunfire, the moment Maria disappeared, and Victor gone soon after. A chill ran along his spine. This was no coincidence. The timing was too sharp, too deliberate. Someone had staged this encounter. Victor poured his drink, lifted it lazily, his tone tinged with ridicule. "You still haven't learned to let go, have you? The war ended long ago, but some men keep digging through ashes. And ashes," he smirked, swallowing a sip, "only hide fire." His eyes cut sideways, settling on the very pocket where David had stashed the passport. "You find something interesting in the night market?" The words sliced cold through David. This was no accident. Victor knew, or at the very least, he suspected that David had stumbled onto a piece of the truth. David steadied his breath, his reply low and firm. "I found nothing. Just passing through." But the lock of their eyes betrayed him. and he knew Victor saw more than the words aloud. Victor laughed, the sound brittle, echoing in the stale air. "You've always been terrible at lying. Listen, David, some things are better left untouched. Swim against the current and you'll drown. Don't make yourself a corpse a second time." He set the glass down hard, the sharp crack filling the room. Rising, he placed a heavy hand on David's shoulder, a touch that felt less like a farewell than a predator's claim. "We'll meet again." As Victor left with his 2 men, the room seemed to drop in temperature. David sat frozen, sweat beading his brow, his hand hovering protectively over his pocket. Shock gave way to a darker certainty. Victor was the missing link. He knew Maria. He knew about the passport, and he was tied to the reason she had lived beneath another name. There was no longer any doubt the search for truth had crossed into dangerous territory. At dawn, when David returned to the old wooden house, something felt wrong the moment he pushed the door open. The air was heavy with the stale reek of cheap cigarettes and the sour musk of dirty leather boots, smells that had no place in his home. His chest tightened, soldier's instinct flaring awake. He moved slowly, eyes sweeping across the living room. The armchair sat crooked, pushed away from its usual spot. A curtain had been torn jagged down the middle. On the floor, splinters of wood scattered like careless footprints of a search that was never meant to be hidden. He hurried into the kitchen, drawers yanked open, utensils strewn across the tile. His heartbeat thundered as he climbed the stairs 2 at a time. In the bedroom, the wooden box of keepsakes lay overturned, its contents spilled in ruin. Old letters, a battlefield map, Maria's framed photo smashed, its glass fractured into a spiderweb of cracks. David froze, his hands trembling as he lifted the broken frame, his fingers brushing across Maria's face beneath the shattered glass. Rage and helplessness welled inside him, burning in his chest as though the intruder hadn't just ransacked his home, but had ripped apart the sacred fragments of his life. On the living room wall, a knife had carved crude words into the wood. "Forget it. She isn't yours anymore." The message stabbed at him, raw and merciless. David's eyes darkened, his body quaking not with fear but with the weight of the insult. Maria, the woman he had mourned for 27 years, was now being mocked as a possession claimed by others. He collapsed onto the steps, breath ragged. For decades he had carried the ghost of her absence, and in a matter of days, everything was upturned. And now, the last refuge of his quiet, a house that had sheltered his grief, was defiled. Boot marks stained the boards, cigarette butts stamped out on the floor. They had left their calling card deliberately, as if to taunt him, to announce themselves without shame. David reached for the old notebook lying on the floor. On the last page he had written just days earlier, "The scar confirms it. She is alive." The ink had blurred under dust, but the words remained. His hand shook as he pressed his pen again, scrawling, "They know what I saw. They want me to stop." The pen slipped from his grip, clattering against the table. His head sank into his hands. Helplessness crushed him, as though every road forward had been barricaded. But deep within, he knew retreat was impossible. To stop now would mean burying Maria once more, and this time, it would be his own hand pressing the earth down. He clenched the broken photograph, a shard of glass cutting into his finger until blood seeped warm against his skin. He did not let go. The sting was a reminder. Maria was still out there, and he could not turn his back. Sunlight broke through the window slats, striking the carved words on the wall, glowing blood red in the morning light. David rose, his posture straight, his gaze hard as stone. Whoever thought they could scare him with broken glass and carved warnings had misjudged him. They had struck at his very roots, and in doing so had fanned the fire inside him hotter. He stepped onto the porch, eyes narrowing on the empty dirt road stretched out in the new Sunday. Yet he felt it an unseen gaze, the shadow of Victor's men watching from some distance. He drew in a long breath, blood still damp on his fists. His heart was heavy with despair, but now it also beat with resolve. The truth was no longer just a longing, it had become a war. The house still carried the stench of dust and dirty boots after the break-in, but David sat quietly at the table, the old journal spread open before him. Its yellowed pages curled at the edges, the handwriting tilted and uneven, but every line cut as deep as an unhealed scar. He turned back to the entry written in that fateful May, the last days before Maria vanished. The letters trembled on the page, as though his younger self had scrawled them with hands still sticky from blood and grit. That night, flares lit the whole sky. Black smoke swallowed the camp. Maria screamed. Her hand slipped from mine. The words sliced open the memory he had long tried to bury. Closing his eyes, David let the nightmare breathe again. He saw the fire's crimson glow, heard the scream of bullets, smelled the acrid mix of gunpowder and burning flesh. He remembered running blind through smoke, his hand groping wildly in desperation. Maria wore a thin coat, her hair tangled, her eyes wide with terror. She cried his name, her voice breaking against the thunder of explosions. He surged toward her, but then a blinding blast tore the ground apart. The force hurled him down, his ears ringing, his sight blurred by ash. When he lifted his head, the space between them was empty, except for Victor. Victor had been close to her then. David remembered him rushing toward Maria, but instead of pulling her to safety, the last image David caught was Victor disappearing into the smoke with Maria in his arms, leaving him stranded in the inferno. Back then he had forced himself to believe chaos had swallowed them both, that Maria had died in the rubble. Yet now, recalling each fragment, he realized Victor had not panicked. His movements were steady, his eyes cold and calculating, already chosen. David's eyes snapped open, his breath ragged. He slammed the journal shut, his palms slick with cold sweat. The pieces clicked together, the smudged death certificate, the missing belongings, the forged passport, and now the memory sharpened to clarity. Victor had taken Maria that night. Their parting was not chance. It was a plan. Maria had not been lost in the smoke. She had been stolen from his grasp. A sharp ache pierced his chest, as if the bullet fired 27 years ago had only now torn open the wound. He braced himself on the table, his head bent, shoulders trembling. He remembered Maria's eyes in that moment, wild, pleading, and he remembered Victor's expression, cold as steel, carrying a silent claim, "She's mine." The recognition left him numb. He had blamed himself all these years for failing to hold her, for letting go at the edge of fate. But now he knew he had not let go. She had been taken. The traitor had robbed him not only of the woman he loved, but of the life that might have been, condemning him to decades of guilt in shadows. David stepped out onto the porch. The cold wind struck his face, the trees whispering like voices of the fallen. He tilted his head back, eyes fixed on the star-laden sky, drawing a breath so deep it seared his lungs. The truth hurt, but it was the only release from memory's chokehold. He was no longer a man lost in doubt. He had seen it, felt it. Victor had orchestrated it all. And from this moment, every step David took would lead straight into that darkness, toward the man he had once called brother, and toward the truth buried in his betrayal. The border town lay still under the sickly glow of street lamps as midnight pressed down, the light brittle and yellow against cracked pavement. David sat in a musty cafe that reeked of scorched coffee beans and smoke-soaked walls. He had been there for hours, staring out through the fogged glass, watching every shadow pass by like a man waiting for a reckoning. His mind replayed the same reel, the blast, Victor dragging Maria into the smoke, and the terrible clarity that had since lodged in his chest. The scrape of a chair beside him snapped him from his haze. A man slid into the seat, a gaunt figure, hair streaked with grey, wearing a faded army jacket that had seen too many winters. His face was scored with lines, his eyes darkened with a history David recognized immediately. Miller, a fellow soldier from the northern base, a man he had not seen in decades. Miller didn't look him in the eye. He bowed his head, his voice rasping, "I don't have much time, but I've heard you're searching for something you'd be wiser to leave buried." David's jaw locked, his eyes unblinking. The man slipped a small packet across the table. "Don't ask who sent me. Just know if you still want to find Maria, this will matter. But beware, that place isn't somewhere men walk into and return whole." N? David's hands trembled as he unfolded the packet. Inside was an old map, edges frayed, with scribbled notes in a rough hand. It sketched out a facility buried deep in the southern hills, lines marking entry routes, blocks shaped as holding cells, and a single H carved in the corner, pointing to a subterranean tunnel. Beneath it, scrawled in jagged ink, "Held M for years." David's body went rigid, his breath seized. For a heartbeat he could not believe his eyes. Hope thundered in his chest so violently he felt dizzy. Maria alive, held there, perhaps all these years, and now the path to her lay in his hands. But just as quickly, a cold dread seeped into his bones. If Miller had risked bringing this, then the facility belonged to Victor, or worse, to someone beyond him. This map was not just a lead, it was a death sentence if caught. David lifted his gaze, meaning to ask. But Miller was already standing, his eyes scanning the room's corners. "I've stayed too long. Don't seek me again. You understand?" His words dropped like stones, final, and then he was gone, leaving only the ghost of cigarette smoke and the hurried shuffle of boots. David sat frozen, the map trembling in his hands. The cafe's clatter dimmed to nothing, replaced by the heavy drum of his heart. The brightest shard of hope he had ever touched was burning in his pocket, but with it came the dark weight of knowing he was marked. He folded the map, tucked it tight into his coat, and turned toward the window. Outside, the night was thick, the lamplight fractured across the street. And there, leaning against a tree across the way, stood a shadow, a cigarette tip flaring, then snuffed. The sight pricked his spine with icy needles. He was already being watched. They knew. Maybe they knew everything. David drew a long breath, steadying the tremor in his chest. The map wasn't just a direction, it was a target pinned on his back. But there was no going back now. Maria had been there. If there was even a sliver of a chance she still breathed, he would follow it, no matter the cost. 27 years he had lived as a ghost. Tonight, he was ready to trade everything, life, breath, blood, for the darkness ahead, where the truth waited. The night was moonless, the sky smothered by grey clouds, the wind cutting sharp across the barren hills. David kept low, his dark coat streaked with dust, every step silent, measured, like a predator stalking. The map in his pocket had led him here to a narrow trail hidden by overgrown brush. Ahead, faint light bled from scattered guard lamps, glinting off coils of barbed wire that wrapped a silent compound in the valley below. His heartbeat quickened, his breath locked tight. Years of soldier's instinct rose again, guiding every glance, every motion. Flat against the ground, he watched two guards pacing slow, rifles slung easy, their rhythm unbroken. He waited for the moment their backs turned the far corner, then slid through grass, his body close to the dirt, until he reached the fence. From his pack he drew wire cutters, the blades biting through metal with a faint snap that seemed to echo too loud in the stillness. Sweat slid from his brow into his eyes, but he kept cutting until the gap was wide enough to slip through. One deep breath, and he was inside. The compound crouched low, concrete walls, steel doors, shadow pooling in every corner. Only a few bulbs sputtered overhead, casting erratic light. David pressed himself to the wall, skirting beneath the gaze of cameras, then reached a rusted door. He slid a thin bar of steel from his pocket, worked it carefully into the lock. The soft click came, and he eased the door open. Damp, musty air hit him hard, thick and sour, choking. He stepped into a corridor, shoes whispering against cold cement. The silence pressed in, broken only by the thud of his own pulse in his ears. Following the map's lines, he turned down the passage, stopping at the final door on the left. The hinges groaned as it swung open. He froze. The cell was empty. 4 stained walls, a single bulb shattered and dangling, a rusted cot pushed aside. No one remained. Only one thing lay in the dust on the floor, a handkerchief. David dropped to his knees, trembling as he picked it up. Weak light caught the clumsy stitching, the letter M. His throat closed. It was Maria's. He remembered her bent over a camp cot, needle slipping through cloth, laughing at her crooked stitches while she embroidered her initial. He had watched her then, proud and tender, never imagining this scrap of cloth would be all that remained. Now, after all the years, it was here, worn, filthy, but unmistakably hers. He clutched it hard, his chest hollow and racing at once. Proof she had been here, proof she had lived beyond the blast. But emptiness tore at him too, because the room no longer held her, only the ghost of her presence. His body shook as though he had touched her breath, only to find his hands closing on air. On the wall, faint grooves caught his eye marks etched in desperation, tally lines scratched one by one. He ran his fingers across them, imagining Maria hunched here, counting days, carving hope into concrete. The thought split him with grief and guilt. All those years she had been caged, while he had sat in the false comfort of his old house, believing her gone. A sound cut through footsteps in the hall. David killed his light and pressed to the wall, every nerve taut. Heavy boots closed in, a beam of a flashlight sliced across the crack of the door. His heart hammered, sweat ran cold down his back. He gripped the handkerchief like a lifeline, muscles coiled, ready. The beam lingered, then drifted away. The boots receded, silence returned. His breath spilled out rough, but his thoughts tangled. The cloth in his pocket was proof, yes, but it raised sharper questions. Maria had survived, but where had they taken her next? When had they moved her? He tucked it deep inside his coat, fingers trembling. The emptiness of the cell pressed in on him, leaving him with the ache of abandonment. Yet he knew this fragile trace was all he had, and it was a thread he must follow. David stepped back into the dark corridor, his jaw tight, his chest heavy. The handkerchief burned against his ribs, a vow sewn into every stitch. Maria was still out there, and he would chase that truth, even if each step drew him deeper into the black maw of the unknown. The corridor lit up with a violent flicker, a bulb sputtering overhead, and the metallic clatter of a latch rang sharp through the silence. Before David could react, 2 shadows lunged from the dark. The butt of a rifle smashed hard into the back of his head, sending him staggering. He tried to fight, but his arm was wrenched behind him, a boot drove deep into his gut, and his breath collapsed into nothing. His body crashed against the concrete floor, the world spinning in white bursts of pain. Heavy boots thundered closer, and through the haze came a low, deliberate laugh he knew too well. Victor emerged from the shadows, his dark suit cutting against the filth of the hallway, his half-smile gleaming with malice. "David Marshall," he said, savoring each syllable, "the proud soldier you once were, still chasing ghosts where you don't belong. This place isn't for men who dig up the past, and Maria, she doesn't even remember you." The words dropped like hammer blows, each one pressing against David's chest. He growled, straining against the iron grips, but the guards twisted tighter, locking his wrists in cold steel cuffs. They dragged him down the hall, each shuffle lit by the stuttering bulbs overhead. A massive steel door groaned open, a breath of air so cold it cut like knives pouring out. Inside lay a freezer of concrete and frost, walls crusted white, each exhale curling into smoke. At Victor's nod, the guards flung David onto the frozen floor. His head struck hard, stars exploding behind his eyes, but he heard the door slam shut, a final note sealing him into this icebound cage. He pushed himself upright, hand shaking as it brushed the blood on his brow. Victor lingered beyond the bars, his shadow stretching long across the icy slab. "You're pitiful," he said, voice flat, almost casual. "For 27 years you clung to a ghost, while I held Maria in the flesh. Did you know she laughed with me once? As if you'd never existed." Each word stabbed deeper, stripping the last thread of dignity. David clenched his teeth, throat raw, but forced out a growl. "You lie." Maria would never forget. Victor threw back his head, laughter echoing through the chamber, bouncing off steel walls until it sounded like a chorus of mockery. "Faith like that," he sneered, "is what makes you weak. Enjoy the ice, David. By morning, it will have finished what the war never did, and no one will remember you were ever here." His footsteps faded, the echo leaving only the hum of cold. David sat slumped against the floor, his body screaming with pain, his lips already numbed purple. Shame washed over him. He, a soldier who had survived fire and desert storms, discarded like broken cargo in a frozen tomb. Yet beneath the gnawing cold, fury flared hotter than ever. Victor had touched the rawest wound, had turned love into ridicule. He thought iron and ice would break David, but in that moment, David saw it clearer than ever. He had nothing left to lose, but everything still to fight for. He pressed his back to the steel wall, eyes closed, breath heavy. The cold gnawed deeper, but the fire inside steadied him. Humiliation and rage fused, shaping into a silent strength, waiting to explode. In the smothering dark, David made his vow. This would not be his end. This was where his war against Victor truly began. The cold in the steel chamber had turned into torture, every breath heavy, every finger stabbed with needles of frost. Shackles cut deep into David's wrists, the skin raw and dark with blood. He leaned against the wall, his mind fogging, but the old soldier's voice inside screamed, "Do not break. Dying here is surrender." He clenched his teeth, eyes scanning the floor until he caught it. A rusted nail jammed in the grout between concrete slabs, bent but sharp. A flicker of light sparked in his brain. Dragging himself forward, chains rattling, he pressed down, fingertips scraping metal. The nail came loose with a faint crack, cold and solid in his palm. He sat back, breath ragged, and began working it into the lock. Years of training, nights in enemy camps, hands trembling but sure, all of it rushed back. Sweat froze against his brow as the nail scratched and clicked inside the mechanism. 1 minute, 2, then a soft snap. The shackle sprang open. His wrists burned, but they were free. He gripped the nail like a blade, the only weapon the dark had given him. The freezer door groaned open, a beam of light slicing across the room. Heavy boots entered, steam curling from the guard's breath. He never noticed the broken chain. David lunged, driving his shoulder into the man's chest, seizing the hand clutching the rifle. They crashed hard, the weapon clattering away. In the struggle, David jammed the nail into the man's throat. Warm blood gushed, spilling fast across the ice. The guard kicked, gasped, and went still. David sat back, chest heaving, hands red, his eyes fixed on the lifeless body, the truth choking him. For years he had resisted killing, had lived quiet, determined to bury the soldier in himself. Now, to survive, he had returned to that ruthless instinct. Even if the man was Victor's pawn, the weight pressed down heavy. He wiped his trembling hands on his coat, the smear dark against the fabric. He told himself the truth. It was him or the guard. There had never been a choice. He picked up the pistol from the floor, his hand shaking at its familiar heft. Salvation and curse, both in one. Stepping into the corridor, his boots left bloody prints on the concrete. Dim bulbs swung weakly overhead, throwing shadows like dying candles. He kept the gun close, muscles locked, ears tuned to every scrape, every echo. His wrists ached with freedom, his soul burdened with death. But under the guilt, something harder had taken root. Determination burned through the doubt. Maria was alive somewhere, and now he had proven to himself that he could still fight, still claw back life from the grip of his enemy. The cost was blood, and more would come. He knew it. Once he left this frozen tomb, the path ahead would be nothing but violence and shadow. But it was the only path that led to her. His fingers closed over the embroidered handkerchief in his pocket. The M, stitched by her hand decades ago. It grounded him, pulled him back from the abyss. His eyes blazed, cruel in their resolve, alive with fury and love intertwined. He had taken survival by blood, and now nothing would stop him. Morning broke thin and pale as David steered the old pickup to the edge of town, where a local hospital hunched between two dust-choked roads. The building was low and tired, white paint peeling, windows patched with crude boards. Its silence felt colder than the dawn air. He killed the engine, sat for a breath, and pressed his hand to the pocket that held the handkerchief stitched with the letter M, as though gripping the last beat of his own heart. Inside, the hallways were mottled with the weak glow of early light. Ceiling fans groaned overhead, stirring the bitter sting of disinfectant. David walked to the front desk, where an old nurse hunched over her ledger. Her wary eyes lifted to him, measuring. In a low, steady voice, he asked for old patient records. She shook her head, files stored away, not for strangers. But when he slid a folded bill across the counter, her eyes shifted, her hand crept to a drawer, and out came a heavy, dust-coated book. David's fingers trembled as he turned the brittle pages, faded ink smearing into ghosts of names. Then he stopped. The words leapt at him. Maria Hale, patient under chemotherapy. Admitted, 2 years ago. His chest jolted. Breath caught. Each letter carved itself into him. Maria, not just a phantom in a photo, not just a trace on cloth. She had been here. In this place. 2 years ago. Alive. He collapsed into a chair, the paper wrinkling in his grip. His mind split open between shock and grief. Shock that the truth stood plain at last. Maria had lived. Grief that when she needed him most, he had been nowhere. 27 years gone, and when her body broke under illness, when she lay in white sheets fighting alone, he had not been at her side. The weight of that absence crushed harder than any war wound. His hand covered his face, his eyes wet. He saw her as if she were before him, Maria in a hospital gown, hair thinning, her frame frail, her eyes still burning with defiance. The vision stabbed at him, sharper than shrapnel. Every night of combat, every lonely hour he had endured, all of it was nothing compared to the loneliness she must have borne alone, in silence, in pain. He turned the page with shaking fingers, but the record ended cold. Transferred. Destination unknown. The words hit like a barricade slammed across his path. His jaw clenched, his eyes burning red. Once again, he was late. Once again, she slipped away the moment he reached her trail. From the desk, the nurse watched him quietly, her expression unreadable. David closed the book, pushed it back, and rose on legs heavy as lead. The hallway stretched long and hollow, walls pale as bone, lights flickering like mockery. Hope and sorrow twisted together in his chest, lifting and drowning him at once. Outside, sunlight struck his face, but it gave no warmth. He stood on the steps, hands buried deep in his coat, fingers clenched hard around the handkerchief. Two worlds collided inside him. One whispered that she was alive, close. The other screamed that he had missed it all. Between them stretched only emptiness, vast and merciless. And David carried it with him, the only companion left to guide his next step. Night pressed heavy, the sky soaked in indigo, the moon swallowed by thick clouds. David followed the road carved into the hillside, guided by a scrap of note from the hospital file, the last record of Maria's transfer. The track was rough stone, winding through black pine that breathed resin and damp earth. He pulled the truck to a halt beneath a rusted iron gate, a weather-worn cross swaying in the wind above. Silence pressed in so deep, he could hear only the thud of his own heart. He stepped out, boots crunching gravel. His hand closed around the handkerchief in his pocket, the stitched M hot against his palm. The monastery gate hung slightly ajar. Beyond it, a brick path leading to grey stone buildings, lit only by weak oil lamps. Their glow spilled across the ground in trembling patches, as if light itself hesitated to linger here. David drew a breath that scraped his lungs. His hands shook as though he were bracing for a war he wasn't sure he could win. Then she appeared. A woman's figure moved into the glow of the gate. Her face, thinner now, older, hollowed by years. But her eyes, those eyes he had carried across every battlefield, stopped him cold. The eyes that steadied him after combat, the eyes that watched him leave home on the last morning of peace. Maria. She stood there in a plain robe, silver hair catching the flame of the lamp. Time had weighed on her, but one glance was enough. His chest seized, breath caught sharp. He wanted to run, to call her name, but his throat burned dry. The sound caught behind his teeth. His whole body trembled, tense as a soldier stepping into fire for the first time. Hope surged, fragile and raw, so thin it might shatter with a blink. He took one step, then froze, afraid too much movement might break the spell. Maria's gaze drifted toward him. Their eyes met in the dark. Just a heartbeat of contact, but it tore through him like lightning. She did not cry out, did not smile, did not move to him. Only a single look deep, weary, unbearably human. Then she turned. Her steps were slow but certain, her figure slipping past the iron gate and vanishing into the monastery's night. David stood rooted, his feet nailed to the earth. His lips parted, but no sound left him. His hands gripped the cold bars until his knuckles blanched, his throat raw with silence. Decades of longing, of mourning, all collided here and ended in her back turned, her retreating shadow. He had seen her, alive, flesh and blood, but despair crashed in, heavy as stone, when she walked away without a word, without a sign she wanted him near. His body shook, not with fear but with the crushing weight of hope given and torn away in the same breath. He pressed his forehead to the iron, eyes shut tight. Questions roared through his skull. Why didn't she come? Why did she leave? Did she not know him, or was she forced to turn? Each question stabbed deep, leaving only emptiness. When he lifted his head, the night wind rushed hard, rattling the pines in a voice like cold whispers. He stepped back, still trembling, his eyes fixed on the place where Maria had disappeared. Hope remained. He had seen her, alive, but it wavered like a candle's flame in the gale, and he knew, if he wanted to keep it burning, he would have to walk deeper into the darkness waiting beyond that gate. The morning after he had seen Maria at the monastery gate, David sat motionless in the cramped room he had rented, pale sunlight slipping through a torn curtain in broken shards across the wooden floor. He hadn't closed his eyes once. All night his mind circled back to the look she had given him, those eyes, meeting his for a breath, then turning away. He felt suspended between hope and despair. A man hung by a thread. A soft knock rattled the door and jolted his chest. He rose slowly, every step heavy. When he opened it, the hallway was empty. Only an envelope lay on the stone, dark brown, nameless, sealed, a single fragile stroke on the front. David. His hand shook as he picked it up. Inside, a folded sheet, the ink blurred in places as if water tears had seeped into it. The first line carved him open. David, if you are reading this, it means we truly crossed paths, but I cannot stay. The handwriting was unsteady, but it was hers, Maria's hand. Each letter pierced like a needle. He read on, his breath ragged. I never died. That night, Victor dragged me into the smoke. He did not just want me, he wanted our child. I was carrying life inside me then, though I had not told you. He discovered it, and that was why I became his captive. To protect the baby, I bowed my head. I took his name. I became his wife on paper. I lived in chains all those years, watching our son grow in shadows, never daring to tell him who his father truly was. David gripped the letter until it crumpled, his vision blurred. The room spun, the air thick, as if robbed of oxygen. His throat closed, choked by an invisible hand. 27 years of belief splintered in an instant. Maria had not abandoned him. She had not betrayed him. She had been forced, cornered, surviving for their child. All his self-blame, all his grief, all his anger at fate, now revealed to be twisted by a cruelty even sharper. He read further. Every line another stone dropped on his chest. You cannot know what I endured to keep this secret. Each day watching Victor raise our son, hearing him call that man father, tore me apart. If I resisted, he would have been lost. Now, I leave you this because I can no longer bear it. Our son is grown. He deserves to know the truth. But beware, Victor will never let go. Tears slid hot across David's cheek. He bent over the table, gasping, his body quaking with a fracture inside him. He had just been given back the wife he thought buried, yet stripped again by the truth. She had lived at the side of the enemy, bound by paper chains that named her his, for decades. And the thought of a son, his blood raised under Victor's shadow, tore his soul. The joy of fatherhood struck him as grief, raw and unbearable. He folded the letter tight and pressed it against his chest, as though Maria's heart might still beat within its creases. He sat there a long time, staring into nothing. In his mind, two Marias merged, the gaunt woman at the monastery and the young wife of years gone. Between them yawned a canyon of lost time. The sorrow smothered him, yet in its suffocation flickered fire. He knew now he was no longer chasing a ghost. Maria lived, and there was a son, his son. But this truth was no gift of joy. It was a sentence, pushing him to the deepest pit of despair. And from that pit he understood, the road left before him was war, and only war. Victor had stolen everything. Now, the reckoning waited. The late sun bled red across the dirt road winding away from the monastery, casting long shadows of the ancient pines. David leaned against the battered pickup, Maria's letter still pressed into his coat pocket, every word carved into his mind. She had confessed everything, and now in his chest burned a flame both trembling and fierce. The child he had never known existed grown, living, shaped in the shadow of Victor. The thought tangled his heart, filling him with both hunger to see and dread that the truth might break him. He followed the faint address scrawled on the slip at the end of her letter. The road led him to a compound, fenced in barbed wire, a private military camp Victor had raised as a mask. Through the glare of floodlights he saw young men in false uniforms drilling in tight formation. David stopped the truck on a patch of bare ground, eyes fixed, pulse hammering. Among the faces, one figure pulled the air from his lungs. A young man, 27, tall, shoulders cut sharp, his step steady, gaze burning with focus. His jawline his own, the furrow of his brow the same. And when he turned in profile, the sorrow and softness in his eyes belonged to Maria. David clutched the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened, tears rising unbidden. He was looking at his son, his flesh, his blood grown to manhood without ever once knowing his father's arms. The sight ripped through him. For years he had lived as a shadow, believing his legacy lost to dust and silence. Now here it was, alive, sweating under the lights, moving with strength inside the cage of his enemy. David lowered his head against the wheel, shoulders heaving, breath ragged. In the storm of grief, an aching joy broke through. Maria had kept him safe. She had guarded their son with the cost of her own chains. He watched for a long time, every motion of the boy, each turn of his head, each drop of sweat across his young face, burning into David's heart. These were the years stolen from him, the first words, the first steps, the growth into youth, all gone. Yet before him stood the proof, strong, unbroken, alive. A whistle split the air. The drills ended, the youths dispersed. His son wiped his brow, sat on a step, and drew something from his pocket. David squinted, his heart stopping cold. A silver chain, its pendant dulled by time, etched with the letter M. He knew it. It was the keepsake Maria had clung to since their wedding day. She had passed it on. Blood and memory still carried forward in that small, shining relic. David braced a hand against the truck door, vision blurred. He longed to rush forward, to seize his son, to tell him everything. But his legs would not move. Fear seeped in. What if the boy turned away? What if Victor's lies had filled him with hatred? What if the truth destroyed him? His grip on the wheel tightened until his joints ached, heart tearing between desperate love and gnawing caution. He stayed until darkness washed the hills, until the floodlights stretched shadows long across the ground. His son rose, body firm against the pale glow, and disappeared through the building's doors. David watched until the entrance shut tight. Alone in the cab, his hand pressed hard to his chest, feeling the heart within pound with a force that shook him. Not only from shock, not only from grief, but from the fierce joy of discovery. He had found his son, and from this moment forward, his fight was no longer only for Maria. It was for the blood of his blood, the son who had never yet called him father. Dusk thickened over the courtyard, the air damp with mildew and the sharp trace of cigarettes. David had watched from the shadows for days, heart torn raw between the hunger to reach for his son and the terror of being turned away. Tonight, when the young man stepped from the barracks, his gait slow, eyes lost in some private horizon, David knew waiting was no longer possible. He left the cover of the trees and walked forward. Son, the word rasped, just 2 syllables, yet it ripped open his chest. The young man froze. The yellow lamp above the entry spilled across his face, strong, unyielding, startled. His eyes widened at the stranger, at the worn, battle-hardened man whose gaze carried years of torment. "Who are you?" His voice shook, yet it cut firm. David drew breath, his hand crushing the handkerchief with the stitched M. "Your father," he whispered. "The blood in you, it's mine." "Isa." The air grew heavy as stone. The boy staggered, eyes clouded, lips parting without words. David stepped closer, voice trembling. "You've never been told my name, but I am the man Maria loved. I am your father." He fumbled inside his coat, pulling free Maria's letter, hand shaking as he held it out. "She wrote this, for you." But before he could bridge the distance, laughter rang sharp from the dark. Victor stepped into the light, black suit gleaming, 2 guards at his side. He strode forward, clapped a hand on the young man's shoulder, and cast David a look like a knife drawn cold. "Don't listen," he said, his voice measured, dripping with possession. "This man abandoned your mother in the fire. I am the one who carried you, who built your life. I am your true father." The boy froze, torn between 2 worlds. The stranger whose features mirrored his own, and the man who had raised him, fed him, carved his path. Instinct drew him a step toward Victor. David's heart cracked. He thrust the letter forward, voice breaking. "Read it. You'll know who I am." Victor moved swift as a predator, snatching the paper, crumpling it in his fist. "Enough. Lies like these aren't worth your ears." "Son," David's voice splintered. "Look into my eyes. You know where truth lives." The boy's eyes stormed. "If you are truly my father, why weren't you here? Why do I only see you now, while he glanced at Victor. "He's the one who raised me." The words cut like steel, each syllable a blade into David's chest. David fell to his knees, clutching his heart, yet his gaze never left his son. "Because I was robbed of that chance. I searched, every day, never stopping. My blood, my love, it lives in you." Victor squeezed the boy's shoulder, eyes sharp with command. "Don't be fooled. He's a relic, a failure. I'm the one who built your life. I'm the man who matters." The courtyard hushed, the air trembling. 3 figures locked in a triangle of blood, lies, and longing. From the monastery window, Maria's pale face watched unseen, her hands trembling against the frame, her heart torn apart. David trembled, but his eyes held fast, burning with both sorrow and love. In that suspended moment, he understood. This was no longer just a duel with Victor. It was the battle to reclaim his son from the grip of deceit. His heart split with pain, but at its core burned a vow. Whatever it took, he would not lose his son again. Night dropped heavy, the air thick with storm, and the warehouse crouched at the edge of town like a block of black concrete swallowed by dark. Inside, crates stacked high, the stench of fuel smeared across the floor, light bulbs swinging weak and sputtering, catching the gleam of rusted weapons. David stepped in, pistol weighted in his palm, his chest heaving. Everything the confession scrawled by Maria, the torn look in his son's eyes, the humiliation of the cold cell fused now into one fire of rage. This was the line he would not back from. The slam of the steel door cracked behind him. Victor slid from the shadows, his black suit armored now, eyes burning with predatory gleam. "At last," he hissed, voice low and slick as oil on stone. "Tell me, David, what is it you want to win back? The woman who forgot you, the boy who never knew you, or the tattered pride of a man who already lost?" He raised a hand. Guards stepped out from either side, rifles drawn. David said nothing. He pulled the trigger. Gunfire exploded, muzzle flashes tearing the dark, bullets pinging off crates, flames spitting where fuel caught. In seconds the place became an inferno. Shouts, clatter of metal, smoke boiling thick. David surged through, dropped a guard, rolled behind a stack of boxes. His heart hammered, but his hands were steady. There was no road back. Through the smoke, Victor drew his pistol and came on. The 2 men, once brothers in arms, stared at each other through fire, eyes loaded with decades of hatred. "You took everything from me," David roared, charging from cover. Gunfire split the air. A bullet seared his shoulder, hot blood spilling, but he drove forward, slammed into Victor, and they crashed to the concrete, weapons skittering away. Fire snapped around them, beams cracking, heat roaring like war drums. They grappled, fists crashing, each blow forged in years of betrayal. Victor fought with brute strength, but David carried the fury of a man robbed of all he loved, a man with nothing left to lose. He locked his hands at Victor's throat, snarling, eyes wild. Victor clawed back, raked his face, shoved him into the blaze, licking across the stacked crates. Flames bit into his arm, skin searing, but David burst up, seized a rusted bar, and swung hard. The iron struck home. Victor reeled, blood streaking his temple, face twisted. David loomed over him, chest tearing for breath, the bar quivering in his grip. This was the end. Victor lifted his head, blood painting his smile. "You can kill me, David," he rasped, "but the truth will unmake you. When you know it all, your own hands will tremble with guilt." His words slithered into the crackle of fire. David's grip clenched, breath ragged. Then with one last strike he brought the bar down. Victor fell silent, swallowed by the smoke. The warehouse roared, flames consuming all. Red light washed David's face, painting him in the glow of blood and ruin. He stood swaying, chest heaving, body broken. Release poured through him, but so too did the echo of Victor's curse. There was no glory here, only the stench of smoke and blood, and the hollow voice of a truth still buried in the dark. Smoke from the burned-out warehouse still clung to David's clothes. The reek of fuel and blood mingled sharp in the night as he walked back to the monastery. His steps dragged as though he carried the dark behind him. The iron gate stood ajar, lantern light flickering against grey stone, and there she was, Maria, frail in a dark robe, hands gripping the fabric as if to hold herself steady. Her face bore the weight of years, but her eyes still shone, trembling as they found his. David stopped short, not because of the distance, but because of the fear of this moment. The first time in decades he would hear her speak the truth with her own mouth. Her voice broke, thin as thread. "David, I have to confess." She held out a worn packet of papers, edges frayed, ink smudged by damp. His hands shook as he took it, unfolded it under the weak light, and his heart fell into a pit. It was the death certificate he had clung to for 27 years. Only now, beneath the official stamp, another line scrawled in Maria's handwriting: "I sign to conceal." David's eyes burned red. His voice rasped. You signed this?" Maria nodded, tears spilling, but her words steeled as if to fight her own shame. "Yes, Victor forced me. If I refused, he would have killed our son before he ever drew breath. I had to die on paper, so the boy could live." The moment ripped him apart. For years he had tormented himself for failing to protect her, for believing she perished in fire. Now he knew it was her own trembling pen that had sealed the lie, deceiving the world, and him. Pain closed his chest, breath hard to draw. "Do you know how I lived?" he choked. "For 27 years I prayed before your picture. I died with you every single day." His voice cracked, body shaking. Maria collapsed against him, weeping, her hands pressed to his chest. "I know. Each day I died too. But if I had not signed, our child would have been lost. I bore the guilt so he could breathe. I let the world condemn me so he might live." Her tears soaked his shirt, each word cutting deep yet unveiling love that had never gone cold. David crushed the certificate in his fist, heart torn open. Yet through the haze of grief he saw what lay beneath it all. Every sacrifice, every lie, had been for their blood. His hand trembled as he let the paper fall, his arms closing around Maria, desperate to reclaim what had been stolen. "It breaks me, but I understand. You chose the only path left." His words staggered out, half forgiveness, half anguish. In his arms, Maria sobbed, "I never stopped loving you. Every day with Victor was survival, nothing more. My heart only yours." David pressed his eyes shut, hot tears carving down his face into her silver hair. The wound remained, the ache unyielding, but in the chasm of memory he finally saw clear. And in that clarity, rage cooled into something heavier, sharper, a vow to pull Maria and their son out of the shadows Victor had built. The monastery bell tolled across the valley, solemn and far, like the heartbeat of a world reborn. David held her close, knowing the road ahead was soaked in blood and shadow, yet the truth had broken free. And in that truth, the love buried for so long flared again, painful but redemptive. The pale gold of dawn spilled over the ridge, soft yet strange, and David stood in the monastery yard, drawing in the sharp chill of morning air. His chest tightened as if the night behind him had been a war that had reached down into his bones. On the stone steps Maria sat, her hair silvered, but her eyes brighter, after confessing all the night before. She lifted her head when she saw him, a frail smile trembling at her lips. He walked to her, sat beside her, his calloused hand covering her thin fingers. Two souls who had lost 27 years now, sat side by side in the quiet morning light. No more barbed wire, no more smoke of war, only silence heavy with tears they could barely hold back. From the shadows of the monastery their son emerged, sunlight striking across his young face, his eyes burning with conflict. He stopped, staring, as if to make sure the vision was real. His parents together for the first time in his life. His heart pounded, all the years under Victor's grip suddenly thrown into doubt. Slowly, hesitantly, he walked forward. Maria's tears spilled as she whispered, "My son." David's voice broke, his throat raw, but he managed, "I am your father." The years collapsed into a single embrace. Three people, torn apart by war and lies, clung to one another under the newborn Sunday. The boy's shoulders shook, his face pressed into his father's chest, feeling the strength he had never known. Maria sobbed aloud, her arms wrapping them both as if afraid the moment would vanish in a blink. David closed his eyes, hot tears spilling, his heart breaking and healing at once. Joy returned, but not pure. It was stitched from grief, darkness, and decades stolen. As the sun climbed, they sat together at a stone table, silent but no longer divided. The young man looked at them both, then said quietly, "I need to know the whole truth." David nodded, his eyes fixed on the misted hills. You will. But truth always comes with wounds. What matters is we are here, together. Maria tightened her grip on his hand, her eyes wet with agreement. Cracks remained, but at last they had found a thread to mend them. When they rose to leave, the boy stopped. From his old pack he drew a thick folder taken from Victor's office before the warehouse collapsed. David's breath caught at the military seal stamped across the cover, the scrawled notes in Victor's hand at the corner. The boy clutched it tight, eyes lit with fear and resolve. There's something in here. He said the truth would destroy us. I don't know if I should open it. David placed a heavy hand on his son's shoulder, his gaze deep and unblinking. Maria stood silent, lips pressed tight, as if she too felt the shadow still hanging over them. The wind stirred, lifting the first page to reveal blurred words, hinting at darker secrets yet untold. The rising sun poured its light over the faces of three people holding one another once more. They had been reunited after 27 years, yet each knew wounds would never fully heal. The folder, the last legacy of Victor, remained, a reminder that darkness still lingered. But in this fragile morning, they had each other, standing in the space between comfort and the echoes of pain. The story of David and Maria reminds us that even when truth comes late, it can still bind back cracks once thought permanent. Though 27 years were stolen, the love they kept alive for each other and their son proved strong enough to draw them close again. Adults know that forgiveness, as David offered Maria, does not erase the past but opens the door for the present. Maria's sacrifice shows the strength of a mother willing to endure everything to protect her child. And in middle age, we learn that life's greatest value is not in what we have lost, but in holding tight to those who remain. Which state in America are you from, or where are you watching from in the world? Leave a comment so I can send my greeting your way, and make sure to subscribe so we can meet again in the next chapter.